Hey Mallards, it is Tuesday. I had a great day recording. Like I said, at the end of the month, I'll have some funny little bits of audio on Patreon, sort of outlining the recording that I did today. So you should go check that out. I also had day 2 of the Birch House residency. Today was all about creative lineage, which is not something I've thought about before, but it's the idea that you have people who influence you, and if you sort of draw back along that line and figure out who influenced them and who influenced the people who influenced them, and so on and so forth, back and back and back and back and back until you get to, I guess, the trunk or the roots of the tree. And then also if you jump, you might find that this branch intersects with that branch, etc., etc. And it's also the idea that you're not necessarily picking the family you're born into, but you do have the option to choose a lineage based on what you do, especially creatively, and that creative people are always building on others to create more things. And I would say that that's definitely true in both aspects of my life. I find it a lot harder to do this sort of this person was influenced by this person was influenced by this person, because I don't necessarily know who the authors I like were influenced by. And it's also kind of a difficult thing to just look up on Google. I feel like it's more difficult in books than it is in physical art. And for theater, it's also tough for me because a lot of the things that influenced me are people that I know, and maybe I could ask them who influenced them, but I can't actively trace it back so well. So I decided instead to sort of make a list of people I would consider to be in my creative lineage. And it's mostly authors that I feel like have heavily influenced me as far as not just how I write, but the kind of stories I like and the kind of stories I enjoy telling. So we have Tamora Pierce, who was probably one of the first authors that really inspired me to be a writer. I read The Protector of the Small series and absolutely loved it. Have been writing characters very similar to that ever since then. It is a huge influence on my creative life. It is especially a huge influence on my role-playing life. RPG characters, I'm fully willing to admit that there probably isn't a Dungeons and Dragons character that I have made that does not belong in a Tamora Pierce novel. They're all Linus Quartet characters or Protector of the Small characters or Wild Magic characters, really any of those. I loved those so much, and she was a huge influence on me. I also really like K.A. Applegate a lot, and her books were a huge influence on me. Not necessarily that they're the kind of books I write, although I would. But that was a big influence because the first fan fiction that I ever wrote was for Animorphs when I was probably, 8 maybe. And it was the first time that a story had spoken to me so strongly that I wanted to put myself in it in a different way. And so I wrote some really, really bad self-insert fanfic, but that grew a love from there. And I also know that tracing back for Tamora Pierce, there's Ursula K. Le Guin, and I've read, or Madeline L'Engle, and I've read some of her stuff. And then when I got a little bit older, I was really into Amelia Atwater Rhodes, who writes vampires and shapeshifters. Because yes, I was a girl who was a teen who liked vampire romance, and I will not apologize for that. Because I think that maybe it's an important part of being a teenage girl. That's what I've decided right now in this moment. You can't change my mind. And one of the authors that was mentioned in her influence was L.J. Smith, who I then read a lot of. For those of you who don't know, she wrote The Vampire Diaries. Don't confuse them with the show. Both are really, really good. Both are wildly different. And I enjoyed Vampire Diaries, but I loved her Night World books. And from there, I started reading Anne Rice. And so tracing that back. And then there are some other more classic things that have influenced me. Obviously, since one of the things that I wanted to do was Rosalind killing Romeo and Juliet. Like, I've got some influence from William Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote a lot of interesting stories that I really like, but I also tend to lean towards the darker side of things. So I really like Edgar Allan Poe and Sylvia Plath. I also happen to really like Sherlock Holmes. I read a lot of folklore, that sort of classic stuff, especially in college. And I like myths and legends. And Sherlock Holmes almost like sits on the edge of being a myth or a legend. And so I really like the Sherlock Holmes series. I really like Sherlock Holmes as an entity and all the adaptations that have come to that. Like, I enjoy seeing different people take different takes on stories. I love a retold fairy tale. And so fairy tales are a really important part of my creative lineage, in the same way that Shakespeare is, and also like Sir Thomas Malory and his Arthurian cycle, and all of the stories about Robin Hood. Like, I like old folklore and how it's retold. And that goes for myths, legends, gods, goddesses, like the whole Joseph Campbell hero cycle, even if we're going like super classic like Beowulf. I really enjoy that base legend, which essentially means like, oh, well, I just like stories because every story is based on the hero cycle. And if you like that, then you like all stories. And yes, I guess that's technically true. But what I enjoy about it is I really like watching people change and adapt and morph things. I love an adaptation of a fairy tale where things are totally unexpected. I love pulling at the thread of something that's true in something and twisting it and turning it into something totally new. That's something that I've always enjoyed. And then it would not be my creative lineage if I didn't mention J.M. Barrie, who is an idol of mine, not just because Peter Pan is who I want to be when I never grow up. I feel like that was an apropos ringing of the cuckoo clock, and I'm actually going to leave it in. But also because I think that J.M. Barrie, as a creative, is the type of person I want to be. Not because he had a great home life or anything, but just because he embraced that childlike wonder his entire life. And he struggled as an artist, and he had problems, and he had hits, and he had flops, and everything in between. But he always valued play and interaction, and also valued the imagination of the young in a way that I think is really important. I have always found that play is a huge part of my creative process. It's a huge part of my creative lineage. Bouncing ideas back and forth with other people, talking to other people, that sort of thing is also a huge part of things. So that's important to me. I'm curious to know who would be part of your creative lineage. Who influences you? What family crest do you want to be a part of? Whether it's the people themselves, or it's how they do the work, or it's the type of work they do. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you tomorrow.